That investigation revealed that Dad had actually severely abused over 100 boys and young men. The allegations of the abuse from the Winchester days were very breathtakingly awful. These beatings were so bad that they would draw blood or cause the recipient to pass out in pain.
What are your earliest memories of childhood and growing up?
I was born in Winchester in 1978. I remember not much actually from the very young years, and it's hard to know if I remember real things or if they're from photographs, because you see photos of your younger years. But I do remember my sister Caroline, who's a little bit older than me, and spending lots of time with her and having fun and swinging on the gate of our driveway. There is a photo that I only saw recently of me in a laundry basket just peeping out, and then there's another one of me in a box actually, and yeah, that was interesting because I do remember that feeling of hiding. I remember all the stages of my childhood hiding and really liking being on my own and in dens, and like I made one in my top cupboards, and nobody knew I was there, and I recognized that started early, and I think when I saw that photo I realized that really has been something I've always done, and it's not really a happy memory, although being on my own felt safe.
So your father was John Smyth, and he was an esteemed barrister. Can you tell me a little bit, I suppose, about his influence in your community and also in the church?
There was a general sense of Dad being a very important person this is my childhood mind, but of him being the most important person in the family, and certainly the central person in the family. I always had the impression that he was well regarded, that he was often out, being asked to speak at things, and clearly active in the community and church and in circles that appreciated what I thought of as his excellence. I was aware from a very early age that he was a brilliant barrister. I think at the time he was the youngest to ever take silk, so he was the youngest QC for a while. And I very much knew that. He was a graduate of Cambridge University. There was just a sense of his brilliance, really, and his influence and his success. I knew as well that as a barrister he'd won many cases, and they were often public. So he was, I suppose, something of a sort of poster child, or felt like a very successful figure.
What was he like, I suppose more specifically, as a father to you, Fiona? What was his mannerisms like at home compared to what he was like maybe outside of the family home?
I think the most striking difference really was his engagement. When I saw him with other people, he was so dynamic, and he would look at them and smile, and he really was brilliant at speaking and listening to people and engaging with them. Certainly my experience of him was really disregard. He just didn't seem interested in me or my life, or to want to spend time with me or my sister, or to really register that we were there. If he was cross with us, if we were doing something wrong, I was frightened of him. I was frightened of him a lot because he was quite a volatile person. I was probably always had a subconscious background fear associated with him because he was very angry and very volatile. That was another difference of him outside of the home and in the home, although other people saw his anger too. But he was very, it was turbulent to live with him. It was like being on eggshells because you never knew what his mood would be like, and if something wasn't right with the meal or with how we looked or how we did something, there could be a huge explosion. I'm sure in retrospect, part of why I hid was because the only time I felt totally fine and safe was on my own and out of sight, because I knew then I wouldn't get in the way of an explosion.
Can you tell me a bit about the young men who used to spend time at your home, and how did they come to spend time at your home, and what was your father's relationship with them?
I do remember that being a totally normal part of our life, that there would always be teenage boys around, particularly at the weekends. And we had a beautiful home with a swimming pool, so people would come for barbecues or parties and pool parties and so on. But they were always teenage boys. But in my mind, I just knew that's what who Dad worked with. And he called it his ministry or his calling, that he was someone who worked with teenage boys and worked in schools and ran summer camps. And so it didn't seem incongruent with that fact that I knew that was what his work was about. Dad would make it clear that he'd prefer us to stay out of the way, my sister and I. He'd say things like, that we were a distraction, that it was just his time with the boys, that it was important that he had time with them, and that if we were there, we would take away from that. So my memory is not joining in, and I found that very hard, as any child would. You can see a party going on, but you can't join in. But I do remember watching and seeing how, thinking they must really, I can see why they think he's fantastic. He was so engaged, as I've mentioned, and would play with them and, put on these wonderful parties and barbecues with burgers and ice cream and all the sorts of things that you love as a child. And thinking, I can see why they think he's terrific. And people would say to me, these boys would say, "You're so lucky to have him as your dad." I do remember thinking, you have no idea.
I do just want to ask if you have any memories of the shed in your home that was, I suppose, a place of abuse.
I remember it being there, and I suppose I now know that it held more weight than any normal garden shed. I remember my brother being taken to the shed, and I knew it was because of some sort of punishment or misdemeanor, or I knew it was something like that. I thought he was perhaps just being smacked, so I knew the shed existed, but I didn't, that was it. I don't remember ever going in there or anything else about it.
So it was 1984 when you moved to Zimbabwe. How old were you when you moved to Africa?
I was 5, turning 6 later that year. So when we actually landed, I was 5.
And do you know the reasons why, or the reasons that your parents gave you for that move?
I don't remember the conversation at the time, but I do remember the general idea was that Dad had been called, or there was some sort of sense of calling or vocation to be a missionary. That was the word that was used in Africa. In time, he set up, very similar relationships with teenage boys, but it was in an official capacity. He set up an organisation that went into schools and ran summer camps. They often came from tricky backgrounds, or they had troubled father figures. I definitely picked that up, that the boys who came to either live with us temporarily or spent a lot of time in our home were people who, Dad would describe as someone who, or I would hear my parents talking about them having a tricky time of it at their own home, and so coming to ours. So there was a feeling that we were offering, our family home was offering something of a support to them.
And I've read reports that as part of the camps and time spent at your home, there was skinny dipping in the pool. Did you know that at the time? Was that something?
I did know that at the time. It was a very my dad didn't try to hide that, and that made me really uncomfortable. I think nudity was something that Dad was very into, I suppose you might say. So even when I was, a teenager in Zimbabwe, he would skinny dip in our pool, even if there was no one else there. He'd have a daily swim, and he would be naked, and I found that really horrible and uncomfortable and offensive. And I just felt so embarrassed and hated the sort of exposure. But I think I probably twice tried to say something like, could you not do that, or could you please put some clothes on? And his response was, you're such a prude. I mean, it's so natural, and you're so oversensitive and prudish and uptight for that. And there was no change, but so him having a sort of culture of skinny dipping on camps didn't surprise me, because he was like that at home. And he said things like, it's just all men together, all boys together, and it's a bonding exercise, or, those sorts of things. And as you know, you don't analyse any of these things when you're younger. It's just how it is. And also don't forget, throughout all this time, Dad was always the centre and always had the final word. And we all believed it, In that conversation about nudity, he brought up the Garden of Eden. That is so typical, that there would be spiritual or biblical references, because he knew the Bible really, really well. And he gave a lot of talks, Christian talks, and he could quote scripture. And that's really powerful too. This is how it was in the Garden of Eden. It's so natural. Affirms the fact that he's probably right and more spiritual than you. And yeah, I guess I am just, the extension of that is I'm the one who's unholy or incorrect, or, that sort of language and biblical references are very powerful if they're used. They can be very manipulative.
And can you tell me about what you remember of the death of a young man named Guy when you were living in Zimbabwe?
It's very hazy, but I do remember the terrible shock that somebody had died on camp. I remember hearing that he had drowned and his body had been found in the pool. And I remember the police coming. And I remember Dad being probably the closest to rattled I ever saw him. He was shocked. He appeared shocked, and I didn't see much of him because he was very busy managing the situation. And you can imagine he had to speak to all sorts of people. The basic understanding I had was that he had gone skinny dipping the night before. I think it was the first night of camp, and they'd gone for a nighttime swim as a dormitory, as a gang of boys. And, for whatever reason, there hadn't been any counting back in, or it was just, run to the pool, jump in, and then you go back to your dorm as quick as possible. And that people didn't register that he was missed, that he wasn't there on the way back. And then it wasn't until the next morning that they found his body. And that was effectively the sum of the information I had at the time.
And I suppose now, looking back, do you believe that that is the full story of what happened to Guy that night?
I've heard his sister talk about the fact that he was a good swimmer, which raises question marks, because I had understood that he couldn't swim, but for whatever reason hadn't said so. So I don't know what happened that night. I don't know. I don't know what, I don't think anyone does, and that's a problem, because it leaves a lot of unanswered questions for people, and particularly for his family, who are obviously never going to get over that terrible loss or the pain of that.
And then growing up in Zimbabwe, tell me a little bit about when and I suppose why you decided to eventually leave the family home.
So I went to school there and stayed there until I was 18, and left as soon as I could, which was really a couple of days after I finished my school, my A-levels. And I guess at the time I definitely felt an urgent need to leave, to get away from Dad. I wanted to be independent. The further I got from home, from living at home with Dad, the clearer I saw things. And it's not my analogy, I must have heard it somewhere, but it is a brilliantly accurate one, where if you're breathing toxic air, you don't know it, but it does affect the way you think, and it makes you kind of hazy and you're not seeing clearly. But as soon as you stop breathing the toxic air, over time, quite quickly, you see things differently. I'd begun to realise that there were question marks about why we'd left. And I'd begun to think that it didn't quite make sense. Or I think I was in circles in the UK, and churches are quite small, and I was going to church. I was a member of church, and I remember there were people who, when I mentioned Dad's name, a shadow would pass across their face, or there would be an awkwardness. But there was just a couple of times where I sensed this negativity around him. And I think I also just began to think about, why did he leave so suddenly? And why did he give up such a glittering career? And the biggest question of all was, I want to know, why did we leave England? was there more to it than you've told us? And so I decided, and it really was because I thought I want a relationship with them, and I want it to be authentic with my dad particularly. And we can only have that if we just talk as adults, about what happened. So I asked him when I was, I think I was 21, I went back there for Christmas, and I said to him, I just want to know what happened and why you left, and can you tell me more about that time? And he reacted so violently. He was sitting in an armchair and he leapt out of it. He was red in the face and incredibly angry. It was like 0 to 60 in a second. And he just started saying, "You're such a disloyal daughter. How dare you question me? It's just, you're another one of those who are slanderers about me. And, if you're not for me, you're against me. And I can't believe you would question. And you of all people, you're my daughter who I've raised." And it was really, really awful and terrifying. And, it was like standing against a massive wind. It was hard to sort of not recoil. It was incredible vehemence. And I remember very clearly thinking, well, now I know there's something more to this. There is definitely a lot of smoke, so there must be a fire. And after that, I went back, and it was a turning point because I came back to England, and I had found that there was a book about the years at Winchester, and I got hold of it. It was by a headmaster of Winchester College called John Thorne, who'd been headmaster there when Dad had, at the time that we had lived there. And I knew there was something about Winchester College in the background. So I started with that book, and sure enough, I read an explicit, it didn't name him, but it didn't need to. It was very clearly my dad, and an explicit couple of paragraphs about him. And effectively it said that he had behaved certainly manipulatively and controllingly and physically punished some boys from Winchester College in the name of religion or something like it. It didn't really go into that, but that he was, I think the word he used was banished, that this man was banished from the UK and left to Africa soon after. And so all of that came from me really confronting him. And after that point, my adult relationship was really different with him.
When was the first time that you fully understood the extent of the abuse that your father had inflicted on these young boys?
Only when it became public knowledge in the Channel 4 expose, which was 2017. Kathy Newman and her team exposed it. That was the first time that me and my siblings knew about the full extent. That investigation revealed that Dad had actually severely abused over 100 boys and young men across 3 countries over the course of his life. And the allegations of the abuse from the Winchester days were very breathtakingly awful. It was beatings to the tune of tens, or I think even hundreds sometimes, of a boy, with the reasoning behind it being that Dad was punishing them for their sins.
The investigation also revealed through survivor testimony that the shed in your home in Winchester was a significant space where abuse was inflicted. Can you tell me about what it revealed in terms of the shed in your family home?
Yeah, it revealed that these boys who'd come over to our house on the weekends, who I saw swimming and having fun at our home, had also, or the purpose of their visit was to Dad to spend time with them in the shed, where they would apparently come with a list of their sins or misdemeanors or things that they had done that weren't right, and that they would bring that to Dad and that he would punish them for their sins with these beatings. And these beatings were so bad that they would draw blood or cause the recipient to pass out in pain, and that they were frequent and extensive, and just, really, really hard to get your head around how that could happen. But that it was a common practice, and that there were quite a few of them, at least 10 more, in that one small period of time, this is not in Zimbabwe, this is just in our home in Winchester, who were over a course of years, a period of years, returning to Dad and under his control, he would say under his discipleship, under his mentorship, and that they were receiving these beatings as common practice.
I think it came out in that report that one of the worst beatings was said to have been over 800 lashes and across a period of 12 hours.
Yeah, I remember the facts being really horrifically shocking, yeah. I mean, it's hard to stomach on so many levels because it's awful. But even just hearing it about your father, from a purely sort of child's point of view, even though as an adult child, it sort of disgusts you, and you can't believe how sordid it sounds and sick. You just think this is just, it's so twisted.
And some of the survivors of your father's abuse, who were young boys at the time, as you mentioned, have publicly spoken out about their experience. Can you tell me a bit about how you reflect on them sharing their testimony and their bravery, I suppose, in coming forward?
The most dominant feeling is gratitude. I can't imagine how difficult and painful and vulnerable it would be for them to have exposed that and taken part in the Kathy Newman investigation. But that point in time, that exposure, that Channel 4 piece was so important to me to understand who Dad was and what he did, and to make sense of so many things, as bitterly difficult as it was to do it and to hear what had happened. And the sorrow that they'd been through that, and yet I felt so grateful, and I still feel really, really grateful to them for their bravery, because it shone a light on who he really was and what he did and the nature of the beast in a way that nobody else could have done, actually.
One of the men who came forward and shared their experience attempted to take his life as an adult. How did learning about that make you feel?
It's sort of inexplicable, really. It's so just like gut-wrenchingly terrible to think that they could have felt that lonely, that out of control, that unable to escape, from Dad's abuse. Yeah, it's really hard to hear. It would be hard to hear about anyone, getting to that point in their lives that they are so desperate that that's the escape. But it's something else to hear it and know that your own father did that.
How did your family, your mother, your siblings react to the realisation and the truth that was brought about in that investigation?
Interestingly, I think that us children and all of us, I don't really remember any of us questioning the truth about it. I don't remember any of us saying, that cannot be true. I think we all felt similarly. We all felt, we sort of approached it as, this exposure has happened and let's talk to Dad about it. There's a possibility here for him to, obviously he can't make right or undo what he did, but there's a window of opportunity for him to apologise and to examine what he did and the implications of it and the consequences of it in light of this investigation. So we very much wanted to talk to Dad, but his total and comprehensive reaction was, we won't talk about this. To do so is question, he said something along the lines of, it's all exaggerated nonsense, and it's not your place to ask me about this, and children shouldn't be questioning and giving an inquisition to their father, and it's so disloyal to even want to talk about the past and dredge up things that aren't your business, effectively. And just don't talk to anyone, don't talk to the press, don't engage with it, it'll blow over, and we don't want to talk about it with you, which was really difficult. And over a process of months, we tried many times to talk to them, and it was obviously having a lot of repercussions in our lives, particularly my brother's. And so there was a real feeling of being not just the truth of what had happened and what Dad had done, but then there was this other thing to deal with as family, which was that he wouldn't even talk about it.
And Fiona, when did you first find out about the abuse that was inflicted on your brother?
He talked to us about that probably in 21 or early 22, when he had, realised that it had happened and had memories of that happening, and it was clearly what had happened to him.
And what was that conversation like for you as a sister?
It was you can't really take on board the pain of what someone's describing to you. It's too much, it's incomprehensible, but it was really devastating. I think it really brought it, the abuse and Dad's just awful wrongdoing from out there to inside our family. And it really brought it home that we had lived with this man and that was something. That really was something to have lived in his sphere, and how it had affected and impacted my brother was just so crushing. And I really love him, so of course hearing about someone you really love, and I adore him in fact, and just hearing about that, what had been done to him was so crushing. It's hard to hear him describe what happened. It's hard to bear the pain of a little boy being treated by his father like that. And then even an adult, he was treated so badly as an adult as well. And it's really hard to hear and hard to comprehend. And yet I've seen him really get into much more kind of a well state and much more whole, and move through that pain to at the other side. He's come on a long way, and you can just see he's personally developed so much through the process of facing what happened.
That's really great to hear, even despite what he went through. Your father passed away before he was ever brought to any sort of justice. How was that for you, and what was the moment that you realised that he had died like?
It's always complex, isn't it? How many emotions you feel simultaneously, and that was one of those moments where there was a lot going on at once. There was definitely a sense of relief that he had died, and that he wasn't in my life anymore. There was that, as you can imagine, but there was also a sense of, I think I very quickly thought about the victims who had been brave enough to speak out, and who I thought, gosh, I imagine they'll be really disappointed. That's a understatement. They'll be in pain not to see him face judicial justice, like a legal process that would validate all that they've said and bring justice. But I think I also felt sad really for him, and just that sense of, he's missed it. He's missed that opportunity. The window's closed. He died estranged from us, and I felt sad, not because I wanted relationship, but because I do actually feel compassion for him. What a terrible way to end your life without any of your close family relationships intact, without really any sense of trying to correct things you've done wrong, it just struck me as a very lonely, tragic, awful way to die.
Since your father's death, what's your relationship been like with your mother?
It's been really different because, in a good way, she's 82, and I think she's so brave to begin to unpack what happened and to face it. And, her years with Dad, she really was kept in this bubble. And I've talked about leaving home and what a godsend that was to breathe clean air, and she never had that. So she really was just in a whole enthrall to sort of his reality and how he described the world. She accepted as that's how it was. She is really different without him controlling her, and I hadn't seen her without him until the last 8 years or whatever it's been. So it's been better, and we're in touch, and we're all trying, in our family, we're all trying to maintain relationship and build relationship and be there for each other. I think there's a recognition as well that we've all been his victims in different ways, and certainly Mum was his closest and perhaps most thoroughly, honestly brainwashed, I would call it, and most thoroughly controlled. She was closest to the epicenter of his power, and he was magnetic, there's no doubt about it, and he was incredibly powerful and controlling, and she was right there next to that power all the time through her life. So I really empathize with that and feel aware that she's lost a lot, through being married to him and through her life with him.
Do you think that your father was a narcissist or had narcissistic traits?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember it was probably about 10 or 12 years ago I first heard about what a narcissist was, and I heard someone describing what it was like to live with one, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, every single box, I would say, same for me. That's how it felt.
What's the legacy of being brought up around a person like your father and the emotional abuse that he inflicted on you and your family?
It's really hard to define in a way what happened to me, though I would definitely call it abuse now, because so much of what happened was almost what didn't happen. It was almost, I wasn't physically abused, I wasn't sexually abused in the traditional tangible senses, but I have talked about the control mechanisms that spanned all those spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional sort of spheres. And I think, that's been working through that and recognizing the control and the narcissism and all of those things, have been difficult because it takes a long time to give voice to what they actually are, and that takes time to do that and to gradually uncover and see. And that's why I say I'm so grateful to my brother and to the other victims for shining a light on who Dad was, because that does give me sort of permission and the light to see what and how it's affected me. But I will say that there's an undervalued thing is how you learn as a child what not to do. And I guess I'm grateful, not to him, but I'm grateful because I have learned a lot. I'm a parent and I have learned a lot about what not to do.
Yeah, how does it feel to be a parent in the wake of your own experience as a child?
I think it feels like an incredible gift and a real privilege. Everyone loves their children, but and I'm no different. But just to have the chance to I feel really grateful to have the chance to have my own family with my own identity and our own identity, and to love them and do better for them. And I hope in some way model, that you can go through terrible things, and how you react to them is makes all the difference. It's amazing to have my own family. They're very supportive and actually just their presence has been part of my healing.
If you could go back and say something to younger Fiona, what would you say to her?
That's a moving question for some reason. I think I would say, wow, what would I say? I wouldn't be able to understand it, but I would probably say something like, don't believe what he says, or don't, every person gets to his point in their life when they register that their parents aren't superheroes and aren't right. And that's part of growing up. That took a lot of unlearning. Years of unlearning that I was of worth and did have value and did have a voice, and I wish I would have told that to my younger self. You don't have to believe that how he treats you is a reflection of who you are.
Thank you.
Dane was my last best friend. You know? Dane, sake. Other than my ex-girlfriend, Dane was the last person that I trusted, you know? And I couldn't get him back in time. And now he's gone.